If you aren't buying, you're walking, old man. I'm not running a homeless shelter. The manager barked, shoving a frail, shivering Arthur toward the freezing Seattle rain. Chloe stepped between them, her tired eyes defiant as she slid a steaming bowl of stew toward the man in filthy rags paid for with her own meager tips. She didn't know the vagrant was a real estate titan whose family was already measuring his coffin. As she tucked a crumpled $5 bill into her apron for her daughter's heart surgery, Arthur watched the vultures in his life vanish, replaced by the only woman who would soon inherit his $2.4 billion empire. Arthur Pendleton sat in the leather-bound chair of his penthouse office, staring out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Seattle skyline. He owned half the buildings his tired eyes rested upon. Pendleton Holdings was a monolith in the commercial real estate world built on 72 years of ruthless acquisitions, sleepless nights, and a heart that had long ago turned to stone. But all the money in the world couldn't buy him a single extra heartbeat. The diagnosis had come 3 days ago. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The leading oncologist at Johns Hopkins had offered him platitudes. But Arthur wasn't a man who dealt in false hope. He had 6 weeks 8 if he let them pump him full of chemicals that would only prolong the agony. He had chosen to decline treatment. Arthur, you have to be reasonable. Harrison Caldwell, his attorney of 30 years, said from the opposite side of the mahogany desk. Harrison was nervously adjusting his silk tie. We need to finalize the trust. Richard and Beatrice have been calling my office every hour. At the mention of his nephew and niece, Arthur's lip curled into a sneer. Richard and Beatrice were the children of his late useless brother. They had never worked a day in their lives, surviving on trust funds and the immense allowance Arthur provided simply to keep them out of his hair. When he had summoned them yesterday to break the news of his impending death, Beatrice had actually checked her diamond-encrusted Rolex while he was speaking, while Richard had immediately asked if the estate taxes would eat into their capital. Let them call. Arthur rasped his voice rough like sandpaper. They are vultures, Harrison. They're circling the carcass before the heart has even stopped beating. They are your only living blood relatives. Harrison reminded him gently. If you don't sign the revised, will the default stipulations of the 1998 trust will hand them the entire company over $2.44 billion in liquid assets and property. Arthur stood up, leaning heavily on his silver-tipped cane. A sharp pain flared in his abdomen, a brutal reminder of the clock ticking down inside him. I built this empire from dirt, Harrison. I grew up with nothing but the clothes on my back and a father who drank his paycheck. I clawed my way to the top and to hand it over to 2 spoiled brats who couldn't negotiate a lease on a lemonade stand. It makes me sick. Then leave it to Charity, Harrison suggested, opening his leather briefcase. The Pendleton Foundation could do immense good. Charity, Arthur scoffed. Bureaucracy and administrative fees. No, I want my life's work to mean something. I wanted to go to someone who actually understands the value of a dollar, someone who hasn't had their soul corroded by entitlement. And where do you propose to find this paragon of virtue in the next month? Harrison asked, a hint of exasperation leaking into his professional tone. Arthur turned away from the window. A strange, almost manic glint had appeared in his faded blue eyes. I'm going to find them myself. That evening, Arthur bypassed his walk-in closet, filled with bespoke Italian suits. Instead, he went into the basement storage of his estate. He found an old moth-eaten canvas coat he had used for gardening decades ago. He took a pair of trousers and deliberately frayed the hems, rubbing dirt from the greenhouse into the fabric. He didn't shave. He removed his platinum P.C. Felipe watch and his signet ring, leaving them on his dresser. When he looked in the mirror, the terrifying, untouchable Arthur Pendleton was gone. Staring back at him was a frail, hunched old man who looked like he had been swallowed and spat out by the unforgiving streets of the city. He slipped a single crisp $5 bill into his pocket, grabbed a battered wooden walking stick instead of his custom cane, and slipped out the service entrance of his estate. The rain was coming down in sheets, a classic bitter Pacific Northwest downpour. Arthur walked for nearly 2 hours. His joints screamed in agony. The cold seeped into his bones and the cancer gnawed at his insides. Several times he stumbled, ignored by the rushing pedestrians who averted their eyes from the homeless man in their path. It was a brutal education in invisibility. Yesterday, Mayers answered his calls on the first ring. Tonight, he was less than a ghost. Eventually, the glowing neon sign of a diner cut through the gloom. It flickered on and off, reading the Starlight Diner. It wasn't a place for the wealthy. It was a refuge for night shift nurses, tired cab drivers, and those who had nowhere else to go. Arthur pushed open the heavy glass door, the bell jingling cheerfully above his head, in stark contrast to the misery of the night. Chloe Bennett wiped her brow with the back of a tired hand. It was 11:30 p.m., and she was already 4 hours into her double shift. Her feet ached inside her cheap non-slip shoes, and her uniform smelled strongly of fryer oil and old coffee. At 28, Chloe felt a decade older. She was a single mother to a 6-year-old girl, Mia, who was currently asleep on her grandmother's couch across town. Mia had been diagnosed with severe asthma and a congenital heart murmur. The medical bills were a mountain Chloe was constantly trying to climb, burying her under late notices and final warnings. By day, she attended nursing school, desperate to build a better life. By night, she slung hash and poured coffee at the Starlight Diner, smiling through the exhaustion. "Order up, Chloe," shouted Mike, the burly line cook slapping a bell on the pass. 2 patty melt side of rings. "Got it, Mike," Chloe said, balancing the heavy ceramic plates on her arm. As she delivered the food to a booth of rowdy teenagers, the diner bell chimed. Chloe turned and saw an old man shivering in the entryway. He was dripping wet, pooling rainwater onto the checkered linoleum floor. His clothes were ragged, stained with dirt, and he looked incredibly frail. Before Chloe could greet him, Greg, the night manager, stormed out from behind the register. Greg was a man who let his minor authority go to his head. "Hey, no loitering," Greg barked, pointing a thick finger at the door. "If you aren't buying, you're walking, old man. I'm not running a homeless shelter." The old man, Arthur, leaned on his wooden stick, his face a mask of practiced stoicism, though his hands trembled slightly from the cold. "I have money," he rasped, his voice weak. "Yeah, right. Let's see it," Greg demanded. Arthur slowly reached into his damp pocket and produced a single crumpled $5 bill. He held it up. Greg laughed cruelly. $5? That won't even cover a slice of pie and a coffee with tax. Get out. You're scaring the paying customers." He stepped forward, preparing to physically shove the old man back into the storm. "Greg, stop." Chloe intercepted him, stepping between the manager and the old man. "Don't touch him." Clear's throat. "Chloe, back to your tables. This isn't your business." Greg warned, his face flushing. "He's a guest," Chloe said firmly, her voice steady despite the risk to her job. "And it's freezing out there. He can sit in my section. Booth 4 is empty. If he stiffs us, it's coming out of your tips." Greg spat, turning on his heel and marching back to the office. Chloe turned to the old man, offering a warm, genuine smile that reached her hazel eyes. "I'm so sorry about him. Please come sit down. Let's get you out of those wet clothes." She guided Arthur to a corner booth away from the drafty door. She quickly went to the back room and grabbed her own oversized dry sweatshirt from her locker, bringing it out to him. "Here, put this on. I'll take your coat and hang it near the kitchen so it can dry." Arthur watched her silently, his sharp eyes evaluating her every move. He accepted the sweatshirt without a word of thanks, playing the part of a bitter, broken man. He slid into the vinyl booth, wincing slightly as his pain flared again. Clear's throat. Chloe handed him a menu. "What can I get you, sweetie? Something warm." Arthur looked at the menu. The cheapest item was a side of toast for $3.50. "I just want hot water," he said gruffly. "And whatever $5 buys." "Well, $5 happens to be the exact price of our Tuesday night special." Chloe lied smoothly. The special was a hearty beef stew with a side of thick bread, and it cost $12.99. "I'll be right back with that hot water and maybe a little tea on the house." Arthur sat alone, absorbing the atmosphere. He watched Chloe move frantically around the diner serving tables, cleaning spills, and dealing with a particularly rude customer who snapped his fingers at her. Through it all, she never lost her composure. She treated everyone with a quiet dignity that Arthur hadn't seen in boardrooms full of Ivy League executives. 10 minutes later, Chloe returned. She set down a steaming mug of Earl Grey tea and a massive bowl of rich beef stew, accompanied by a basket of warm rolls and butter. "I didn't order tea," Arthur grunted, purposely being difficult. "And I told you I only have $5. Don't try to trick me into paying more." "No tricks," Chloe said softly, pouring him a glass of ice water as well. "The tea is from my personal stash and the meal is covered. Please just eat. You look half-starved." Arthur picked up the heavy metal spoon. The stew was incredibly hot and tasted better than the Michelin star meals he had eaten in Paris the month prior. He ate in silence, watching her. He knew she was paying for his meal out of her own meager earnings. He had seen her slip a $10 bill to Mike the cook when she thought no one was looking. When he finished, Chloe came by to clear his plates. "Did you get enough to eat?" "It was adequate," Arthur said, maintaining his grumpy persona. He reached into his pocket and placed the crumpled $5 bill on the table. "Here for the food." "Keep it," Chloe said, gently pushing the bill back toward him. "You need it more than I do." "I insist," Arthur said, his voice suddenly dropping the frailty, taking on a commanding tone that made Chloe pause. He slid the $5 back to her side of the table. It was his tip, a pathetic $5 tip for a $12 meal she had paid for. Chloe looked at the bill, then up at the old man. Clear's throat. She didn't look angry or insulted. She just looked deeply sympathetic. "Thank you," she said softly, putting it in her apron pocket. Arthur looked her dead in the eye. "Tell me something, girl. What would you do with that $5? Chloe smiled a little, wiping down the table. "Honestly, I'll probably put it in my daughter's piggy bank. We're saving up. She wants a real bicycle for her birthday, not a hand-me-down." Arthur leaned forward, the intensity in his gaze piercing through his disguise. "And what if it wasn't $5? What would you do if I gave you $5 million right now?" It was a ridiculous question from a man wearing a waitress's borrowed sweatshirt, reeking of wet canvas and poverty. Most people would have laughed or rolled their eyes and walked away, but Chloe stopped wiping the table. She looked at him, really looked at him, sensing an odd gravity in the air. $5 million? She repeated, resting her hands on her hips. She looked out the diner window at the rain. "Well, first, I'd pay for Mia's heart surgery, so she wouldn't have to be afraid of running too fast. Then I'd pay off my nursing school debt so I could finally get my degree and start helping people properly." She paused, looking back down at him, her expression turning dead serious. And then, Arthur prompted, his heart beating a little faster. "And then I'd buy this diner," Chloe said, her voice hard with sudden conviction. "I'd buy this diner, and the very first thing I would do is fire Greg for the way he treats people who don't have a warm place to sleep. Nobody deserves to be made to feel like garbage just because they're going through a hard time. Money should be a tool to protect people, not a weapon to make them feel small." Arthur sat frozen. The words hit him like a physical blow. Money should be a tool to protect people, not a weapon to make them feel small. It was the exact antithesis of everything his nephew Richard stood for. It was the exact opposite of how Arthur himself had lived his entire life. He stared at this exhausted, debt-ridden, beautiful soul of a woman, and the stone around his heart finally irrevocably cracked. Arthur did not finish his tea. He didn't need to. The warmth spreading through his chest had nothing to do with the Earl Grey, and everything to do with the astonishing clarity that had just pierced through his decades of cynicism. He stood up, sliding Chloe's oversized, faded University of Washington sweatshirt off his shoulders and folded it neatly on the vinyl seat. "Keep the $5, Chloe," Arthur said, his voice stripped of the frail, trembling act he had walked in with. It was the voice that had commanded boardrooms and terrified rival CEOs. "Put it in Mia's piggy bank." Before Chloe could process the sudden shift in his demeanor, Arthur turned and walked out the glass doors, into the relentless Seattle downpour. He didn't hunch his shoulders against the wind this time. He walked with the terrifying purposeful stride of a man who finally knew exactly how his final chapter would be written. It was 2:14 a.m. when Arthur's private elevator opened into his penthouse. He ignored his soaking wet clothes and walked straight to his mahogany desk, picking up his secure phone. He dialed a number that he knew would be answered no matter the hour. Harrison. Arthur barked the moment the line clicked open. Wake up, get dressed, and get over here. Bring your dictaphone and the master files for the 1998 trust. Arthur, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. Harrison Caldwell's groggy voice came through the speaker. Are you having a medical emergency? Should I call the paramedics? The only emergency is that I have been a fool for 20 years, Arthur snapped. I'm rewriting the will, all of it. Be here in 20 minutes. While he waited, Arthur made a second call. This one was to Thomas Sterling, a former FBI field agent who now ran the most exclusive private intelligence firm on the West Coast. Sterling handled corporate espionage and background checks for Pendleton Holdings. Sterling, I need a comprehensive dossier by sunrise, Arthur ordered. Her name is Chloe Bennett. She works the night shift at the Starlight Diner on 4th Avenue. She's a nursing student and she has a 6-year-old daughter named Mia with a heart condition. I want to know her debts, her medical providers, her academic standing, everything. Spare no expense. By the time Harrison arrived, clutching a leather briefcase and looking utterly bewildered in his hastily buttoned trench coat, Arthur had already showered and dressed in a sharp charcoal grey suit. He looked like a king preparing for war. Arthur, what on earth is going on? Harrison asked, setting his briefcase on the desk. You look different. I am different. Harrison. I'm awake, Arthur said, pouring them both a glass of scotch. Sit down. We have a $2.4 billion empire to redirect. For the next 4 hours, the penthouse office was a whirlwind of legal maneuvering. Arthur systematically dismantled the trust that would have handed his life's work to his nephew and niece. Instead, he instructed Harrison to draft the most ironclad, impenetrable legal structure the state of Washington had ever seen. At 6:30 a.m., Thomas Sterling's encrypted file arrived on Arthur's tablet. Arthur read through it, his jaw clenching. The reality of Chloe's life was even harsher than she had let on. She owed over $60,000 in student loans to Chase Bank. She was 3 months behind on rent. The medical bills from Seattle Children's Hospital for Mia's cardiology appointments were staggering actively, threatening to push her into bankruptcy. Yet despite being suffocated by debt, she had paid for a homeless man's meal out of her own pocket. It's confirmed, Harrison, Arthur said quietly, staring at a photo of Chloe and her little girl in the file. She is the one. Arthur, I must urge caution, Harrison pleaded, reviewing the furious scribbles on his legal pad. You are proposing leaving the controlling stake of Pendleton Holdings, the largest commercial real estate portfolio in the Pacific Northwest, to a 28-year-old waitress you met 6 hours ago. The courts will tear this apart. Richard and Beatrice will claim you were not of sound mind. Let them try. Arthur growled softly. He reached into his drawer and pulled out the card of Dr. Alistair Vance, the chief of psychiatry at Virginia Mason Medical Center. I want 3 independent psychiatric evaluations conducted today. Bring the doctors here. I will prove my cognitive function is in the top percentile. I want this legally bulletproof. Harrison, if my family tries to contest this, I want the legal fees to bleed them dry. Harrison sighed, realizing there was no stopping the force of nature. That was Arthur Pendleton. And what exactly are the terms for Chloe Bennett? Arthur steepled his fingers, a profound sense of peace settling over him. First, an immediate anonymous wire transfer to clear all her debts, mortgages, student loans, everything. Clear's throat. Second, a dedicated medical trust established exclusively for Mia Bennett at Seattle Children's Hospital, funded with $50 million. Whatever treatment she needs anywhere in the world, it's covered. Arthur paused, his eyes narrowing as he thought about the diner. Third, purchase the Starlight Diner and the land it sits on. Transfer the deed directly to Chloe Bennett. And finally, the company. The bulk of the estate, Harrison confirmed his pen poised. The controlling shares of Pendleton Holdings will be placed into a blind trust Arthur dictated. Chloe will be the primary beneficiary. However, she will not be thrown to the wolves. You, Harrison, will remain as co-trustee and primary advisor for a period of 5 years. You will teach her the business, you will guide her. And knowing her, she will use this empire to build housing fund hospitals and actually do some damn good in this city, rather than just hoarding wealth like a dragon. Harrison stopped writing. He looked up at the old billionaire, finally seeing the genius and the heart behind the madness. It's highly unconventional, Arthur, but it might be your greatest legacy. It will be, Arthur said, standing up. Now type it up because at noon I am having a little family reunion. At precisely 12 p.m., the heavy oak doors of Arthur's Columbia Center boardroom swung open. Richard Pendleton strutted in first, wearing a bespoke Tom Ford suit that cost more than most people made in a year. He was busy typing furiously on his latest iPhone, barely glancing up. Behind him sauntered Beatrice, complaining loudly to her assistant on her AirPods about the Seattle traffic. The scent of her overpowering Thousand Labo perfume filled the room instantly. She tossed her crocodile Hermes Birkin bag onto the polished mahogany conference table with a careless thud. Neither of them asked how Arthur was feeling. Neither of them noticed the pallor of his skin or the way he leaned heavily on his cane at the head of the table. "Uncle Arthur," Richard said, finally pocketing his phone. He offered a practiced hollow smile. "Good to see you out of bed." Harrison said it was urgent. "I assume we're finalizing the transition timeline. I have a meeting with the board of directors next Tuesday, and I'd like to have the voting rights transferred by then." Beatrice took a seat, inspecting her manicured nails. "And Arthur, darling, I've spoken with a premier real estate agent about the Mercer Island property. Since you won't be needing it much longer, it makes sense to list it before the market cools off in autumn." Arthur sat perfectly still. He let their words hang in the silent air of the boardroom. He looked at the flesh and blood of his brother, two adults who had never experienced a moment of hunger, a sleepless night of worry, or a single consequence for their actions. "Sit down, Richard," Arthur commanded. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Richard frowned clearly, unused to being spoken to in that tone, but he took the plush leather seat opposite his sister. Harrison stood quietly by the window, a thick bound legal folder resting in his hands. "I brought you both here today to discuss my final will and testament." Arthur began, his voice dangerously calm. "As you are well aware, my time is limited. I have spent the last few days reflecting on my legacy and what I want the Pendleton name to mean when I am gone." "Of course, Uncle." Richard nodded solemnly, playing the part of the grieving heir. "We are ready to take up the mantle. We won't let you down. You already have," Arthur said. The words cracked like a whip. Richard's fake smile vanished. Beatrice looked up from her nails, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me." "You are vultures," Arthur said, leaning forward, his piercing blue eyes locking onto them. "You are spoiled, entitled parasites who have spent your entire lives waiting for me to die so you can feast on the corpse of my hard work. You view my company as an ATM and my properties as poker chips. Arthur, you're not well," Beatrice said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sudden panic. "The cancer is affecting your mind. Harrison, do something. He's delirious." Mr. the Pendleton was evaluated by 3 leading psychiatrists at Virginia Mason this morning. Harrison stated smoothly, without missing a beat. He scored perfectly on every cognitive assessment. "He is entirely of sound mind, Beatrice." "What is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, standing up, his face flushing red. "I am your nephew. I am the Vice President of Acquisitions, a title I gave you to keep you out of my hair," Arthur retorted. "You haven't closed a successful deal in 4 years. So let me make this incredibly clear. I am not leaving you the company, Richard, and I am not leaving you the estate, Beatrice." Silence descended on the boardroom. It was absolute and suffocating. You can't do that," Beatrice whispered, the color draining from her face. The 1998 Trust. It guarantees. The 1998 Trust was dissolved at 8 a.m. this morning. Arthur said, a grim satisfaction washing over him. My entire estate, liquid assets and controlling shares of Pendleton Holdings have been placed into an irrevocable blind trust, controlled by a new primary beneficiary. Who, Richard yelled, slamming his hands on the table, who did you give our money to? Some charity, some gold digger, someone who actually understands the value of $5. Arthur said softly, though the meaning was entirely lost on them. Clear's throat. Someone who possesses a shred of human empathy, something neither of you has ever displayed. Richard sneered, pacing the room like a caged animal. We will sue. We will tie this up in probate court for a decade. We will hire every ruthless litigator in Washington state and bury this beneficiary in legal fees until they beg to settle. You won't have the funds to hire a paralegal, let alone a litigator, Arthur said coldly. He gestured to Harrison. Harrison read them their inheritance. Harrison opened the thick folder. To Richard Pendleton and Beatrice Pendleton, Arthur leaves a specialized conditional trust. This trust will pay out an annual stipend of $50,000 to each of you. $50,000, Beatrix shrieked. That won't even cover my property taxes. That's a rounding error. Let me finish, Harrison said sharply. The $50,000 will be paid out monthly only upon the submission of a W-2 form and pay stubs, proving that you have maintained full-time employment working no less than 40 hours a week at a minimum wage job in the service or retail industry. Richard stared at the lawyer, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. You're joking. You expect me to flip burgers if you wish to eat? Yes, Arthur replied. If you are fired for cause, or if you quit your job, the stipend is immediately revoked and the remaining funds in your trust will be automatically donated to the Seattle Downtown Women's Emergency Shelter. You will earn your keep, or you will starve just like the rest of the world. Beatrice burst into tears, her expensive makeup running down her face. Richard looked like he was going to lunge across the table, his fists clenched, his breathing ragged. You vindictive old man! Richard spat venom dripping from his words. You're going to die alone, and no one is going to weep for you. Arthur smiled. It was the first genuine smile he had worn in years. It reached his eyes, erasing the exhaustion of his illness. Perhaps, but my conscience will be clean. Get out of my office. You have job hunting to do. As security escorted his screaming, sobbing family out of the building, Arthur turned to look out the window. The rain had finally stopped, and the afternoon sun was breaking through the heavy Seattle clouds. His empire was safe. The vultures were banished. Now there was only one thing left to do. He had to go back to the Starlight Diner and tell a waitress that her life was about to change forever. Friday evening at the Starlight Diner was a chaotic symphony of clattering plates, shouting cooks, and the endless hiss of the espresso machine. Chloe Bennett stood by the register, her hands trembling as she stared at the pink slip of paper resting on the counter. You're firing me, she whispered, the noise of the diner fading into a dull roar in her ears. Greg, please. You know about Mia's appointment on Monday? If I lose my health insurance? I don't care about your kids' appointments, Chloe. Greg sneered, crossing his thick arms over his stained manager's shirt. He tapped a finger aggressively on a crumpled receipt lying next to the pink slip. You thought I wouldn't check the ledger. You comped a $12 beef stew for that homeless vagrant on Tuesday, rang it up as a void, and tried to cover the register shortage with your own tips. That's a violation of company policy. It's theft. I paid for it with my own money. Chloe protested, her voice cracking. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, born of pure, desperate exhaustion. I didn't steal anything. He was freezing. He had nothing. He was trash. And so is your work ethic. Greg shot back, his face flushing with the petty thrill of authority. Pack up your locker. You're done. And don't expect a good reference. Chloe felt the floor tilt beneath her. The mountain of debt, the terrifying medical diagnosis, the sheer weight of trying to survive in a city that charged for the very air you breathed. It all came crashing down. She reached for her apron strings, her vision blurring with unshed tears, wondering how she was going to look her 6-year-old daughter in the eye and tell her they were out of options. Then the diner went completely, chillingly silent. The bell above the door hadn't just jingled. It had chimed violently as the heavy glass door was pushed open by a towering man in a dark suit with an earpiece. Thomas Sterling stepped inside, his sharp eyes scanning the room, assessing every patron before he nodded to someone outside. Through the pouring rain, a sleek midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom had parked directly in the red zone in front of the diner. A moment later, Arthur Pendleton stepped over the threshold. He was entirely unrecognizable from the shivering, ragged old man who had sat in booth 4 just days ago. He wore a custom-tailored navy blue Bayonne suit that draped perfectly over his frail frame. A platinum-part Philippe watch gleamed on his wrist, and he leaned on a solid ebony cane topped with a silver lion's head. Flanking him was Harrison Caldwell clutching his ever-present leather briefcase. Every eye in the diner was glued to the imposing figures. Men like Arthur Pendleton didn't walk into the Starlight Diner. They bought the block, demolished it, and built glass towers in its place. Greg's arrogant posture vanished instantly. He practically tripped over his own feet, rushing out from behind the counter. A greasy, sycophantic smile plastered across his face. "Gentlemen, welcome to the Starlight," Greg stammered frantically, wiping his hands on his pants. "I'm the general manager. Can I get you a private booth coffee? We have a lovely cherry pie." Arthur didn't even look at him. His icy blue eyes swept the room and locked onto Chloe, who was standing frozen by the register, her apron half untied. He walked slowly toward her, the rhythmic thud-click of his ebony cane echoing in the quiet diner. When he reached the counter, he looked down at the pink termination slip resting next to the crumpled receipt. He read it in silence. It seems Arthur said his voice a low, commanding rumble that made Greg physically flinch. "That no good deed goes unpunished in your establishment, Mr. Manager?" Greg blinked, utterly confused. "Sir, I was just dealing with a problem employee. She broke policy. We run a tight ship here." "A tight ship steered by a blind captain," Arthur murmured. He turned his gaze back to Chloe. The hardness in his eyes melted away, replaced by a profound paternal warmth. "Hello, Chloe." Chloe's breath hitched. She stared at the sharp jawline, the piercing eyes, and the familiar, unyielding posture. It's you, the man from Tuesday. The hot water." "Arthur Pendleton," he said, offering a slight, respectful bow of his head. "And I have come to return something that belongs to you." He reached into the breast pocket of his suit and pulled out a small, exquisite silver frame. Inside the glass was a crisp, neatly pressed $5 bill, the exact bill she had slid across the table to him. "I told you to put it in Mia's piggy bank," Arthur said, gently placing the frame on the counter. Greg let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "Wait, you're Arthur Pendleton, the real estate billionaire, sir? I apologize. If I had known you were doing some kind of undercover thing, I would have comped your meal myself. I threw you out. I was just doing my job." "Your job," Arthur interrupted, finally turning his terrifying gaze upon Greg, "was to manage a restaurant. Instead, you chose to humiliate a starving man. And now you are attempting to destroy the livelihood of the only person in this room with a shred of human decency. A woman who paid for my meal when she is drowning in medical debt for her child." Greg stammered, backing away as Sterling took a menacing step forward. Arthur snapped his fingers. Harrison stepped up, opening his briefcase and producing a pristine manila folder. "Mr. Manager, as of 9 a.m. this morning, Pendleton Holdings finalized the purchase of the commercial real estate lot encompassing the Starlight Diner, as well as the business license itself," Harrison stated, his lawyer's voice carrying cleanly across the room. "You are no longer the manager of this establishment. In fact, you are trespassing on private property." Greg turned ghostly pale. "You bought the diner because of a bowl of stew." "I bought the diner," Arthur corrected. "To ensure that weeds like you are pulled from the garden before they choke out the flowers, you reap exactly what you sow. Greg, you are terminated, effective immediately." Sterling, escort this man off my property. The security expert grabbed Greg by the back of his collar with effortless strength and marched the sputtering, shocked manager out the front door, tossing him onto the wet sidewalk. The diner erupted into spontaneous, shocked applause from the cooks and the regular patrons. Mike, the line cook, let out a loud whoop from the kitchen window. Arthur turned back to a paralyzed Chloe. Now that the trash has been taken out, he said, a small smile playing on his lips, we have business to discuss. May I sit in your section? I believe booth 4 is open. Chloe sat across from Arthur in booth 4, her hands gripped tightly in her lap. A fresh cup of untouched coffee sat between them. Harrison sat at the adjacent table, giving them privacy, while keeping a watchful eye on the door. Mr. Pendleton, I don't understand, Chloe whispered, her mind struggling to process the whiplash of the last 10 minutes. You bought the diner just to give me my job back. I didn't buy the diner to give you your job back, Chloe, Arthur said quietly. I bought it to give it to you. He slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the table. Inside this portfolio is the deed to the property fully paid. It is in your name. There is also confirmation of a wire transfer that has cleared the balance of your student loans, your outstanding rent, and every single medical bill you currently owe Seattle Children's Hospital. Chloe stared at the leather folder as if it were a bomb. The blood rushed from her face, leaving her dizzy. No, I can't accept this. This is millions of dollars. I just gave you a bowl of stew. You owe me nothing. You gave me back my faith in humanity, my dear. A commodity that is entirely priceless, Arthur said, leaning forward. His breathing was becoming slightly labored, the pain in his abdomen flaring, but he ignored it. But that is not the end of it. The trust documents in that folder outline a $50 million medical endowment created explicitly for your daughter Mia. She will have the best cardiologists on the planet. She will get her new bicycle, and she will ride it without fear. A strangled sob tore from Chloe's throat. She covered her mouth with both hands, the dam finally breaking. Tears streamed down her face, dropping onto the vinyl table. The suffocating weight that had rested on her chest since the day Mia was diagnosed was suddenly miraculously gone. Why? She wept, looking at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. Why me? Because the meek shall inherit the earth, Arthur said softly, his voice thick with emotion. And because I have spent my life building an empire of dust. When I am gone, which will be very soon, Chloe, my controlling shares in Pendleton Holdings, will transfer to a blind trust. You will be the primary beneficiary. Harrison will guide you. You are going to take my wealth, and you are going to use it to protect people just like you protected me. Before Chloe could even attempt to comprehend the magnitude of what she was hearing, billion-dollar empires, terminal illnesses, blind trusts. The calm of the diner was violently shattered. The front doors banged open with a crash that rattled the windows. Richard Pendleton stood in the doorway, soaked in rain, his designer suit disheveled, and his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. He was flanked by two burly men who looked less like bodyguards and more like street thugs. Did you really think it would be this easy, you old fool? Richard shouted, his voice slurred with alcohol and rage. He spotted Arthur and marched toward booth 4, ignoring the gasps of the patrons. Harrison immediately stood up, but Richard shoved the older lawyer hard into a table, sending silverware clattering to the floor. Sterling was at the door in a flash, but Richard's thugs moved to block him, creating a tense standoff. Richard, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. You are making a terminal mistake. No, you made a mistake when you cut me out. Richard snarled, looming over the booth and glaring at Chloe. Is this her, the little waitress? The gold digger who battered her eyelashes and stole my inheritance? He leaned close to Chloe, who shrank back against the vinyl seat. Listen to me, you piece of trash. I know exactly who you are. I know about your little girl Mia. I know you leave her alone with your half-blind mother every night. I made a phone call to Child Protective Services an hour ago. I told them you're dealing drugs out of this diner. By tomorrow morning, your kid will be in the system and you'll be in a cell. Chloe let out a terrified gasp, her maternal instinct flaring into sheer panic. "Don't you touch my daughter." Arthur did not raise his voice. He did not stand up. He simply looked at his nephew with the cold, detached gaze of an executioner. "You always were a scorpion, Richard," Arthur said smoothly. "Blindly striking out even when the fire is closing in around you. You think you're ruthless. You are merely a child playing in the ashes of men." Richard laughed mockingly. "What are you going to do, Uncle? Fire me again? I'm going to contest the will. I'm going to ruin her life, and I'm going to watch you die knowing you failed." "Harrison," Arthur commanded softly. The lawyer, who had recovered his footing, pulled a sleek black smartphone from his pocket. He tapped the screen once. "I anticipated your tantrum, Richard," Arthur said, resting his hands on his cane. Clear his throat. "When I ordered a full forensic audit of your department yesterday morning, I didn't just find incompetence. I found wire fraud. You've been embezzling from the Commercial Development Fund for 3 years to pay off your offshore gambling debts." Richard's mocking smile froze. The colour instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and grey. You can't prove that. It's protected under 'I can prove everything.'" Arthur interrupted his voice, echoing with absolute authority. "Including the $75,000 bribe you attempted to pay a city zoning commissioner last month. A conversation that Thomas Sterling acquired the audio recordings of this afternoon." Richard took a stumbling step backward, the liquid courage evaporating from his veins. He looked frantically at his 2 hired thugs, who suddenly looked very uncomfortable. "Hard karma is a bitter pill to swallow, nephew," Arthur said, pointing a trembling but resolute finger at the window. Red and blue lights suddenly began strobing through the rain-streaked glass of the diner. 3 Seattle Police Department cruisers pulled up boxing in Richard's parked SUV. Uniformed officers stepped out into the downpour, marching purposefully toward the diner doors. "You're not losing your inheritance, Richard," Arthur said, the finality of a judge passing a sentence ringing in his words. "You are losing your freedom. Have a pleasant time in federal prison. I hear they don't serve caviar." As the police entered the diner and slammed Richard against the counter to read him his rights, Arthur finally let out a long, shuddering breath. The adrenaline faded and the agonizing pain of his illness rushed back in, but he barely felt it. He looked across the table at Chloe, who was staring at him with a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. "Your daughter is safe, Chloe," Arthur whispered, reaching across the table to gently pat her trembling hand. "The darkness will not touch your family ever again. I promise you that." The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers faded into the rainy Seattle night, taking Richard's furious, muffled shouting with them. The silence that fell over the Starlight Diner was profound, broken only by the steady drumming of the rain against the glass. Arthur Pendleton exhaled a long, ragged breath. The sheer force of will that had kept him standing over the past 48 hours finally evaporated. His legs gave out. "Arthur!" Chloe cried out, rushing around the table to catch him before he hit the linoleum floor. Harrison was there a second later, supporting the old man's weight. "Virginia Mason Medical Center now." Harrison barked to Sterling, who was already speaking rapidly into his wrist microphone to bring the Rolls-Royce around. Arthur spent the final 3 weeks of his life in a sunlit private suite overlooking the Puget Sound. He was no longer the terrifying titan of industry, nor the ragged vagrant in the rain. He was simply a man who had finally found his soul at the end of a long, dark road. Chloe practically lived at the hospital, bringing Mia with her every afternoon. The little girl, with her bright eyes and fragile heart, brought a light into Arthur's sterile room that no amount of money could buy. They coloured pictures together, and Arthur told her stories of building skyscrapers from the ground up. On a quiet Sunday morning, the winter sun filtering through the blinds. Arthur's breathing grew incredibly shallow. Chloe sat by his bedside, holding his frail, liver-spotted hand. She opened the small leather-bound Bible she always kept in her purse. Proverbs 11:25. Chloe read softly, her voice thick with emotion, but Clear's throat steady with absolute faith. "A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. You refreshed us, Arthur. You saved us. Arthur turned his head slowly, a peaceful, transcendent smile resting on his lips. And you? You saved me, Chloe. My empire of dust has a soul now. He closed his eyes and the heart monitor slowed to a final steady tone. Arthur Pendleton was gone, stepping into eternity with a clean conscience and a legacy secured by grace. The aftermath of Arthur's death was a testament to the inescapable reality of hard karma. Divine justice had finally balanced the scales for the Pendleton family. Richard Pendleton never saw a dime of the $2.4 billion estate. His offshore accounts were seized by federal investigators and he was sentenced to 9 years in a minimum security federal penitentiary for wire fraud and attempted bribery. His designer suits were traded for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. Beatrice, utterly cut off from the endless fountain of Pendleton cash, was forced into the exact life Arthur had mandated to receive her meagre stipend and avoid eviction from her newly rented cramped studio apartment. She had to maintain 40 hours a week at a local grocery store. Stripped of her Hermes, Clear's Throat, bags, and Larbo perfume, she spent her days bagging groceries in a scratchy polyester uniform, enduring the very same dismissive attitudes she had inflicted on the working class her entire life. Chloe, however, stepped into the light. Mia's surgery at Seattle Children's Hospital was a resounding success. 3 months later, on her 7th birthday, Mia rode a gleaming pink bicycle through the park, laughing brightly, her lungs full, and her heart strong. Chloe graduated at the top of her nursing class, no longer burdened by the crushing weight of student loans. But Chloe didn't just stop at saving her own family. Guided by Harrison Caldwell's steady hand, she transformed Pendleton Holdings. She halted the development of luxury condos and redirected billions into affordable housing initiatives across the Pacific Northwest. Remembering the biting cold that used to aggravate Mia's severe asthma and armed with her nursing expertise, Chloe expanded Mia's medical trust into a global force. She looked to the most isolated freezing corners of the globe where children suffered without access to modern care. Within 2 years, the Pendleton Bennett Global Pediatric Initiative fully funded and opened a state-of-the-art respiratory and cardiology clinic in Yakutia, Siberia. It stood as a beacon of warmth and healing in one of the harshest environments on Earth, ensuring that no mother in the frozen tundra would ever have to watch her child struggle for breath without hope. As for the Starlight Diner, Chloe kept it exactly as it was. She fired, Greg promoted Mike the line cook to general manager, and instituted a new permanent policy. Anyone who walked through those doors, cold, hungry, and unable to pay, was to be served the finest beef stew on the menu entirely on the house. Because Chloe knew better than anyone that sometimes a single bowl of soup and $5 of faith could change the entire world. This incredible true-to-life story serves as a powerful reminder that our actions echo far into eternity. Arthur Pendleton spent his whole life chasing wealth, only to discover that the greatest treasure he could ever leave behind was a legacy of compassion and divine justice. Chloe's unwavering kindness as an underdog not only saved her daughter, but transformed an empire to heal children all the way from Seattle to the freezing plains of Siberia. True wealth is found in the grace we show to those who have nothing to offer us in return. If this story brought tears to your eyes and warmed your heart, please smash that like button and share it with your friends and family to spread the message of hope and hard karma. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our daily dramatic stories. Drop a comment below and tell us how would you use a billionaire's fortune to change the world. See you next.